Hello there, and welcome to News Talks, the new podcast from Times Higher Education, in which we will get behind the headlines and discuss the biggest stories in global higher ed. I'm your host, Miranda Prynne, and I'm joined for this inaugural episode by our esteemed editor, Chris Havergal. Chris, great to have you on.
Thanks very much for having me, Miranda.
How are you feeling about this departure from the written word?
Well, it's always a bit of a leap. I suppose I've been in the editor job now for about 10 months, and I have, on occasion during that period, had to get used to being, rather than the person asking the question, being the person who's answering the questions. It's got a slightly strange sensation, but I am gradually getting used to it, and hopefully this is just another step on that journey.
Quite. Well, there's no lack of news in higher education at the moment. In the UK alone, impending changes to UK RI funding allocations have sparked widespread upset. Student loans have become a national talking point, and universities' financial woes continue to ripple in every direction. But today we are going to focus on a case that opened in the High Court in London this week, the University of Sussex versus the Office for Students. Essentially, the University of Sussex is challenging an OFS ruling that lumped the university with a £585,000 fine for failing to uphold freedom of speech and academic freedom. And this fine came as a conclusion of an OFS investigation into Sussex's handling of the case of Kathleen Stock, a philosophy professor who had faced protests over her gender-critical views, which ultimately led to her resignation, and that was back in 2021. So, Chris, court cases go on all the time. Why has this one, which is being reported across all national news outlets, why has this become such a cause célèbre?
Well, I suppose the Sussex case and the Kathleen Stock case, it combines two of the most contentious and headline-grabbing issues in higher education and arguably in society more generally. Transgender rights and freedom of speech and how those can be balanced, which is something that public institutions are still really trying to work out. As you say, it has its roots in the departure of Kathleen Stock from Sussex in 2021, and you set out a bit of that. But, that followed protests by students against her gender-critical views and a lot of internal debate among Sussex staff as well. It was an extremely difficult time for Sussex, which at the time made headlines around the country, and came at a time when there was widespread concern about cancel culture and no platforming on university campuses. Since Kathleen Stock left Sussex, she's become, I suppose, both a standard bearer for gender critical thinking, and that's clearly become much more prominent in societal debates over the last 4 years, and also a vocal critic of higher education institutions. So it brings all of those touchstone issues together in one case. And I suppose there's an additional element for universities as well. We've talked about Sussex. The other side of this case is the Office for Students. And for universities in England, it taps into concerns that the OFS as a regulator is overly combative, too burdensome, and overreaching in its regulatory approach. This was an investigation which dragged on for many years. Sussex argues the investigation was highly flawed. The fine that's come at the end of it, £585,000, is a big sum of money at a time when the sector is under great pressure. So it brings all of these issues we've been talking about in higher education for the last 4 years together in one explosive case, heard in the High Court this week, and it'll be fascinating to see what the eventual ruling is.
What are the key points upon which the University of Sussex is challenging the OFS? You referenced that they are critical of the way the investigation was conducted, but what else?
This is one of the strange things about this case, because we've talked about Kathleen Stock, and that's the starting point for this investigation. The OFS ruling, as it came out eventually, doesn't have a great deal to do with Kathleen Stock's departure from Sussex. That was just the starting off point. What the OFS then did was look at policies in place at Sussex, which have been in place for many years, specifically those relating to trans and non-binary equality. there's particular concern over policies which states things like course materials should positively represent trans people and trans lives. And the OFS took the view that this could infringe on freedom of expression and lead to staff and students self-censoring. So there's already a bit of a leap from where you've started to where the ruling came. And so Sussex have challenged this on a number of grounds. Some of them are quite technical, about what constitutes a governing document of a university and whether the OFS should be able to scrutinise lower level documents like the sort of trans and non-binary policy I've discussed. And also a question of whether the OFS is actually allowed to impose a fine on Sussex. Sussex says it's an exempt charity established by Royal Charter, and the only person who could sort of judge whether they'd breached their rules is actually the King. Now, that's quite a technical argument, but also an argument that could have really very far-reaching implications if they were to win that for the OFS and probably for the King as well. So there are also some more sort of fundamental points which come across a bit more clearly. Sussex argue that they should be able to impose restrictions on staff which are necessary to, I think their words are, maintain order and academic standards in the university. They would say, freedom of speech is never absolute. It always has to be balanced, and universities have a right to protect students from harm, from harassment. And they say that even if someone had breached this policy, this trans policy, it wouldn't necessarily have led to an academic losing their job or their privileges because they've got other statutes which govern freedom of speech in the university. So there's that just fundamental point that the OFS is perhaps being just too absolutist in its approach here. There's also a question around fairness, which I think Sussex feel very strongly about. This policy that was in place was actually based on a template which was widely used across the sector at the time. It was produced by Advance HE. And many universities had very similar policies, and none of those, apart from Sussex, have faced OFS sanctions over this issue, certainly not to this extent. So there's a question why they're being singled out, not least as they have now updated the policies in question to put greater emphasis on freedom of expression. There's just a final point, which is really about a procedural point, and whether the investigation was done properly and done fairly. Sussex say they asked for meetings with the OFS on 9 occasions during the course of investigation, and all were rejected. It was largely a desk-based exercise. The person it took evidence from was Kathleen Stock, and that happened twice. So Sussex just simply say this isn't fair. This isn't a way for a regulator to conduct an investigation. It's now a matter for a judge to decide whether that's the case or not.
Yes, it really is about interpretation of the law. And it'd be interesting to see what Mrs. Justice Leven makes of it. But your point on the policy templates, we know that there was a whole roster of universities rapidly looking to amend and remove their policies off the back of this fine for the exact reason you described, that this was essentially a template used by many institutions across the UK. One interesting question to consider is why Sussex feels this is worth challenging. I mean, as we've already mentioned, the history behind this case goes back all the way to 2021, when there was a different Vice-Chancellor, Adam Tickle, in place. And arguably the world and higher education has changed quite a lot in that time. Yes, it is a hefty fine, but some might say, why not take the easy option and just pay up? What do you think Sussex and their now Vice-Chancellor, Sacha Rosenhill, what do you think their motivations might be?
Fundamentally, it reflects genuine anger over the way that Sussex has been treated, and also a sense that they think they've got a really strong case. They're going into this thinking that they're going to win. I don't think any university goes to court, which, let's remember, is an expensive process and no guarantee it'll end well. You don't go into it unless you think you've got a very strong case. I think there's a bit more to it than that. I think there's a sense that Sussex is fighting this not just for themselves, but they would feel perhaps for the wider sector as well. So I think they're quite worried that this case potentially sets a worrying precedent for universities in terms of regulator overreach and intrusions on university autonomy, and especially at a time when the OFS is taking on more powers in relation to free speech coming out of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. So I think the case they're trying to make is that there needs to be a recognition that academic freedom can never be absolute, and that universities do have to balance that with protecting their staff and students from discrimination and harm. Now that's not to say that all of that was applied perfectly in the case of Kathleen Stock and in the case of the policies at Sussex, and we'll see what the court makes of it. But I think the university is concerned that if the regulator is going to take such an absolutist approach to issues of free speech on campus, universities think that the job of balancing those competing priorities, which they're trying to do and every public authority is trying to get to the bottom of, they think their job's going to be much harder, and in essence they'd only be able to discourage a very small portion of speech which would be considered to be illegal. So I think they feel very strongly about it. I think they've got a good chance of winning, but I think they also feel it's incumbent on them to do that for the future, regulatory layout of the sector.
There's no doubt that universities are having to walk an ever narrower path, perhaps, between upholding freedom of speech and protecting academic freedom, but also ensuring that very diverse student and staff populations, communities all feel safe and welcomed and respected within the campus environment. And it's easy to see there is a natural tension there, and it's difficult for these organisations. Because of that, of course, this is a battle that characterises tensions and challenges that have been preoccupying many in UK higher education for some time and could mark a pretty pivotal moment. I gave a very brief summary of what led to this case, and you've padded that out a bit, but could you talk us through the backdrop to this in a little more detail and just explain for those who are perhaps less well versed what happened in the case of Kathleen Stock?
So Kathleen Stock left Sussex. It was October 2021 that happened, and there'd been protests by students against her gender-critical views. There'd also been a statement from the University and College Union branch at Sussex, which had urged management to take, I think the words were, a strong stance against transphobia. And Kathleen Stock described that, in her words, of having sort of effectively ended her career at Sussex. So we said that was the time that the OFS started its investigation. But at that time, they didn't actually have the power to investigate individual complaints. That was due to come in with the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, but actually the complaint scheme that would allow the OFS to look at those complaints is yet to be brought in. So it did focus, as we said, on the policies and this trans and non-binary equality policy statement. So what was in that was requiring course materials to positively represent trans people, a requirement that curricula wouldn't rely on stereotypical assumptions about trans people, that transphobic propaganda wouldn't be tolerated, and that transphobic abuse or bullying would be treated as disciplinary issues. Now, the OFS concluded that these restricted lawful free speech and had a chilling effect on academic freedom. We've heard that Sussex have clearly challenged that very strongly. The Sussex case is that say you were to swap out, if we talk about particular minority groups, if you were to swap out trans people with, for example, people from ethnic minorities, anything like that, and you were to sort of have curricula that might rely on stereotypical assumptions of that, universities would regard that as being deeply, deeply problematic. We've talked a lot about Sussex's case so far. I suppose it is worth reflecting, though, that this does have its roots in Kathleen Stock's departure, and that actually wasn't a very happy period for Sussex, or a period that Sussex can be particularly proud of. Here you had a prominent professor with views which are now sort of recognised as being protected, as a protected belief, and she was effectively, to her mind, hounded out of the institution. Sussex would question, well, what could we have done differently? But we do know that the comparable case to this is the Joe Phoenix case at the Open University, which was one which went before an employment tribunal in a way that this case hasn't. In that case, university behaviour was found to be seriously lacking. So despite all of what we said about Sussex's case, it's not to say that this was their finest hour.
What could it mean for the sector if Sussex does successfully overturn this OFS ruling?
There's a range of grounds which the OFS is being challenged on, and it partly depends if Sussex is successful at all, and then on which grounds the appeal would be allowed on. Some of those technical arguments about governing documents, whether the OFS can fine older universities, if Sussex was to win that would really severely limit the OFS's ability to regulate free speech. Particularly, it would only be allowed to look at those high-level documents. And I think universities which are still looking at how to balance free speech and protection from harm, they're still reviewing lots of these policies. they'd possibly be slightly emboldened to shift slightly towards more robust policies on harassment and inclusion than would otherwise be the case. But I actually think probably the greatest impact, if Sussex do win this case, and we should say it's probably a couple of months before we find out whether they do or not, I think the greatest impact would probably be reputationally on the OFS. Many vice-chancellors are already questioning and have long questioned whether the OFS is up to the job and whether it's the type of regulator that we need in a very different environment to the one when the OFS was set up the best part of a decade ago when we were creating a higher education market. We've now got a higher education system which is extremely challenged financially, and the argument would be that actually the sector probably needs regulation and support to be sustainable and to serve communities in the way that we want universities to do, rather than this focus on issues like freedom of speech, which, while of course hugely important, the excessive focus that some universities would say we've seen from the OFS has perhaps distracted from that central mission. So that would only answer those questions, and certainly vice-chancellors would feel those doubts, but possibly policymakers would as well.
So then what about the opposite outcome if the OFS ruling is upheld?
Yeah, well, I mean, that would certainly strengthen the OFS's hand. It would certainly vindicate their approach. And arguably, I suppose, universities would see it perhaps as having a further chilling effect on anti-harassment policies, those that go beyond sort of minimum legal requirements. I think also it could lead to higher penalties in future cases. The initial thinking of the OFS was that Sussex could face a fine, running into millions of pounds. And one of the reasons it came down was that, well, actually, this is the first time we've had a case like this, and we're just sort of setting out the ground. I think the warning to the sector would be that any other universities that found themselves falling foul of the OFS on free speech grounds could face much stiffer penalties. I think universities would argue ultimately in that case it would become much harder for them to offer inclusive environments in a university setting, that they would feel that all of their steps in this area around trying to protect students from harassment or discrimination would always have the threat of punitive regulatory action hanging over them. So I think it would be a big win for the OFS, and it would make it quite difficult for some universities.
Yeah, and that is one of the core or the key points of Sussex's challenge, that a university does have rights to set a code of conduct within its walls that goes beyond simply what is legal. This is, however, a highly divisive issue. There are a lot of academics who actually come out clearly on the side of the OFS in this battle, and those who are members of campaigning groups like Academics for Academic Freedom and other such bodies. What are their arguments? Why are they so in favour of stronger controls on this issue?
They see, in cases like this and many others we've seen in the sector, they see academic freedom being constrained by what they regard as overzealous university managers and particularly advocates of policies in spaces like equality, diversity and inclusion. And to put it simply, they just don't trust universities to mark their own homework on this issue. They think that greater regulatory control is needed in order to protect freedom of speech. I suppose the other reason they want to see it is because there's sort of unfinished business in this area, and there has been for many years. We've referenced the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. That came in, but as I've said, key parts of that haven't been enacted. So the complaint scheme, which could have, if it had been in place at the time of Kathleen Stock's departure from Sussex, could have led to a very different sort of investigative process. That still hasn't come into action, which is why the Sussex investigation has been stuck on these fairly dry regulatory arguments that are being fought out now in the High Court, rather than as a simple question of whether Kathleen Stock's academic freedom was infringed or not. Those campaigning academics would also like to see another part of that act come in. It was called the statutory tort, which would allow OFS to sort of issue fines in those individual cases rather than it having to go to court. So all of this, with Labour coming into power, enacting some of that act, but not all of it, has left us in a bit of a sort of halfway house. And that's why there's still a group of academics who feel that this issue isn't properly resolved and they would like ministers to go further.
Of course, their perspective is very much that higher education had fallen into a kind of accepted orthodoxy on a lot of what they would see as contentious issues that deserve open debate, and that anyone who digressed from those accepted views was going to be made to feel very unwelcome. Finally, you've mentioned that many vice-chancellors are possibly suspicious of some elements of how the OFS currently functions, but what is your sense of what sector leaders feel about this case and Sussex's position on it?
It's something I've spoken to quite a few vice chancellors about, and actually, there's quite a range of opinion, as you'd expect, sort of across every level of academia. As we said, there probably is quite a widespread concern about the OFS as a regulator and whether it's too burdensome and overreaching. I think a lot of vice chancellors would support that. But there's a question of whether this is the grounds to fight that battle on. Is there ever a winner when you go to court in a case like this? Although Sussex could win or win part of their case, I think a lot of vice chancellors would have concerns about how Kathleen Stock was treated and the end of her time at Sussex and how that was handled. And I think they would fear the risk might be that universities risk looking out of step on this issue around balancing freedom of expression and trans rights. An issue where the balance for public opinion has arguably shifted somewhat in recent years. I think there are certainly some vice-chancellors who think Sacha Rosenhill, the Sussex vice-chancellor, should have just blamed this on her predecessor, said this is the previous regime, and either sought to come to some sort of settlement before it came to a final decision, or sort of take it on the chin. Clearly, she didn't feel able to do that. Ultimately, views on this case, reflect just how complex it is and how contentious the issues that it raises are. And that's about gender critical academics, trans rights, academic freedom, and the role of the OFS. As we said, it brings it all together in one case, and it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see how it pans out.
Yes, and of course, as you've said, we will not know the outcome of this case for some months as Mrs. Justice Leven considers the points that have been put before her. Perhaps the longer term impact we may all hope for is one that lands somewhere in the middle, with universities more careful in future to push back against cancel culture, work actively to address polarization and lack of reasoned disagreement, but also the OFS placing a bit more trust in institutions to find this balance alongside policies that are designed to make everyone, regardless of their beliefs, their politics, sexuality, gender identity, and so on, feel welcome.
We'll see. And many would hope that.
Yes. And on that note, time for us to wrap up. Thank you very much for joining this first episode of News Talks.
Thanks for having me, Miranda.
So that's it for this week, folks. We will be putting out new episodes every fortnight, covering one of the biggest stories of that week. Please do like and subscribe, and we will be back with you in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.